This is Evan Robb with DisruptED TV, and I'm excited today to be joined by David Geurin from Bolivar, Missouri. Welcome, David.
Hey, Evan, thanks for having me on. Excited to be here today.
Absolutely. You know, David is a 2017 NASSP Digital Principal of the Year. He's a high school principal, and he is an author, and he's very involved on Twitter. And David also has a blog, which I want to point our viewers to at davidgeurin.com. And particularly, I want to talk about your book, David, which I very much enjoyed, called Future Driven. There are a lot of things in Future Driven that resonated with me, but let's talk a little bit today about your concept of educators as futurists, and also the idea of being college and career ready, and also being life ready. And I know you touch on those things within your book.
Absolutely. So really, the idea for Future Driven came about just thinking about that the students in our schools, we aren't preparing them for the world that we grew up in. We're preparing them for the world that they're going to live in. And so because our classrooms don't have students from 20 years ago, they shouldn't look like classrooms from 20 years ago. They shouldn't be preparing students for the world of 20 years ago. We want to be future driven. We want to be preparing them for the world that they'll live in. And so futurists or scientists or social scientists who make predictions about the future don't always know exactly what's going to happen, but they think in terms of with the future in mind. And when educators do that, then we're better able to think about what our students might need to thrive in this complex, unpredictable world that they're going to live in.
David, what you talked about classrooms and how classrooms need to change, a lot of times when I read about that and I think about it, I think about, there are not a lot of businesses that you could say, if you look back to how they were 100 years ago, would you be able to recognize them and how they function? And now this is not a declarative statement, but in some cases, many schools are not that much different than they looked in terms of how classrooms were set up many, many years ago. Technology is in place. We have smart boards versus blackboards, but a lot of classrooms are in rows. A more compliant sort of based learning versus what you talk about in your book, which is much more active, exploratory, and integrative.
Absolutely. And I think that no matter what school, even the schools that are trying to keep up, that are really trying to be forward thinking, I think are struggling because things are changing so fast. The rate of change in our world is exponentially faster, and we've got to be thinking about that in terms of what we're doing in our schools.
David, let me ask you, so you're a high school principal, and how do you envision high school classes, the way they look and the way that students select classes changing over the next 5 or 10 years? I know a lot of high schools focus on integrating more project-based learning, performance-based assessment versus more traditional types of assessment. And I wonder if you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of different things that I think make that are changes that need to happen, or that I think we're going to see happen. Authentic learning, project-based learning is one piece of that, something that I know that we're working on in our school. I think customization in general is going to be very, very important for education. There's going to be other ways that, we're seeing more and more online opportunities for students. School choice is the word of the day. And some of that school choice, of course, I'm not real jazzed up about, but we want to create choices within our public schools where students we can meet their needs and help them to move towards their goals in ways that don't put them in a box. And I think we've had a one-size-fits-all approach, and we just need to think in new ways to meet the needs of all of our students.
David, you have a great story in your book, Future Driven, about a horse that you had when you were a youngster. The horse's name was Snowball. And in your book, what you tell a couple of things about Snowball. I'll leave one part for someone to read the book and find out about your experience with Snowball. But what I will also say is Snowball was a one-trick pony. Snowball was a carnival horse, and you had said would walk in circles. frequently, right?
Yeah, that is what she did all day, every day. Yeah.
And so,
And my granddad picked her up at an auction, and he was a farmer, and he thought it'd be fun to bring this pony home. But yeah, all she wanted to do was walk in circles. That's what she was trained to do.
and I think that, the analogy I know that you speak to in your book, is comparing that to education, and at times to the way that some classrooms in some places may be taught, that a one size fits all approach. And, I was certainly a product of that. I can recall math classes where it was done one particular way, and the students would either get it or they wouldn't get it. And students would make personal judgments about their math ability based off of how they would do in that class. So if you do well, you're a great math student. If you don't do well, oh well, no one in my family did well in math anyway, and math isn't really for me. But what resonates in the book and what I hear your message, is much more about personalization and looking a lot differently at how we do what we do.
Absolutely. And I think the adaptability piece there happens we need to create adaptable schools because we want our students to be adaptable learners. And the snowball analogy was also pointing out the fact that years ago, someone would get in a career and they would stay in the same career for their lifetime.
Sure.
Until retirement. And now it's far more common that you may have multiple careers, or you may be part of the gig economy and have multiple streams of a living doing different skills that you have, but not work in one clearly defined job role for many, many years.
David, also in your book, you and I have something in common, which I have not shared with you, is we're both big fans of Alvin Toffler. And you do have a really famous Toffler quote in your book, which is that people need to be able to learn, unlearn, and then relearn. And maybe you can talk a little bit to how that relates to the principal's role in changing culture, because sometimes people need to start thinking and learning in a different way when we want to have people start thinking about change.
Yeah, change is difficult. I read somewhere the deeper we get into our professional career, it's even harder to change because we develop habits that we get things where they work well. Teachers sometimes are very good at their approach, which can be traditional teaching, and maybe they get good test scores, and maybe the engagement level of their kids is pretty good. But are they getting to that really deep level of thinking that is helping their students kind of take more ownership in their learning? I think it's not just being successful in a certain kind of way, but being willing to look at what's the way that is best going to meet the needs of today's kids and today's learners, not just what works best for me. And so we just try to pose those questions, and I try to pose those questions in Future Driven, so that we're really thinking carefully about what we're doing and why we're doing it.
Yeah, Future Driven does a really good job, at getting the reader to reflect on that. And and it sounds to me like you're certainly working with your staff, communicating, and I'm sure at times challenging people's thinking to get them to think differently and consider different ways to do things. Very exciting. Sounds like you're doing a wonderful job. David, we are about at the end of our conversation. So before we end, is there anything else that you'd like to share with our viewing audience?
Well, I appreciate you, Evan, and what you do and what you contribute to education, and for inviting me to do this recording today. I've had several people request to do a Twitter chat around Future Driven and the topics in the book. And so Sunday, August the 5th at 8:30 Central Time, we are going to launch the Future Driven Twitter chat. Just going to be a 30-minute chat. And then right after that, Bold School chat happens as well. That's one that I've participated in quite a bit. So a couple of good things on Sunday nights if folks are interested in connecting with other educators who are passionate about learning and change and moving schools forward.
Wow, David, thank you very much for sharing that. Encourage the viewing audience to check out your Twitter chat. And if you are not following David on Twitter, he is at David Geurin, capital D, capital G. David, I'd like to thank you very much for having a conversation with me today and wish you all best for the upcoming school year. This is Evan Robb reminding you that if you want to bring creativity and innovation into your life, sometimes you need to disrupt your routine.